This story happened to one of you subscribers. Write any 8-letter word in the comments if you've ever felt like you saw or heard something unexplainable. It happened in my family a long time ago. We seemed like an almost normal family from Arizona, but we had one peculiarity: special culinary preferences. This dark secret brought us closer together, and we called ourselves people predators or people daters. It was all presented in a playful, goofy manner. Looking back now, I'm surprised my dad didn't stick a Hannibal Lecter on-board bumper sticker on his car. After all, you don't choose your parents, right? I remember the evening when everything changed. It was raining. Suddenly, the door slammed against the frame with such force that I almost dropped my mug of milk. The creak of the hinges sliced through the air like a knife, and the house, usually warm and quiet, seemed to shrink around me. My father entered first. His boots left muddy prints on the clean carpet, as though he carried something into the house that didn't belong there. My mother followed, glancing over her shoulder as if checking to make sure no one was watching them. But all my attention was fixed on what they were carrying. I saw the feet first, bare, dirty, with wounds caked in sand. They dangled limply like those of a puppet. My mother held the body by the shoulders, and my father by the legs. Their movements were synchronized, trained over years. They didn't say a word, only heavy breathing, the whisper of wind through the open door, and the rhythmic scraping of skin against skin filled the room. My grandmother followed behind them. She carried a woven basket from which a spicy aroma of herbs wafted, but the gleam of knives was also visible inside. Her steps were soft, almost silent, but her gaze was sharp, like the knives she carried. "You're not in bed yet," my mother snapped sharply, as if catching me in some indecent act. I shook my head, too stunned to find the words. A heavy metallic smell hung in the room. My grandmother placed the basket on the table and said curtly, "Wipe the floor. The blood must soak in, or it'll come back to haunt us at night." Her voice was calm, as though she were discussing the weather. My father snorted, as if it were an old family joke, one only they could understand. They carried the body down the hallway as usual toward the basement. I didn't see its face, but one glance was enough for me to understand that this time was different. There was something wrong in the way it lay, as if it wasn't afraid. Usually, victims resisted, screamed, left scratch marks on doors or bruises on my father's arms. But this one, it simply was. Like a ghost in the flesh, it had a troubling calmness and just watched detachedly. I felt a deep connection to this man, as I was also used to observing my family's actions from a distance. Expressing emotions in our family wasn't encouraged, especially by my grandmother. My brother appeared a minute later. He yawned loudly, leaning against the door frame, lazily twirling a garden pruner in his other hand. His perpetually messy clothes and hair somehow made him even more intimidating. "Cleaning again?" he smirked, picking up a chain from the floor. "You know you'll have to carry your own one day, right?" I didn't reply, just gripped the rag in my hands more tightly. When the basement door closed behind them with a metallic clang and the sound of chains followed, I felt the air in the house grow heavier. It had all been routine since childhood, but this time there was something different in the sounds and the looks exchanged, something that made my heart clench. Maybe it was the victim's gaze, cold and calm, like a mirror reflecting a version of myself I didn't want to see. Whatever it was, tonight Mom would be cooking a roast, the second one this month. I wasn't supposed to go downstairs, but the smell, that same metallic, heavy, sticky scent, was too strong to ignore. Every time the basement door opened, it filled the house, mingling with the spicy aroma of herbs from my grandmother's basket. I could hear my parents' voices coming from below. My brother joked, his laughter sounding like the crunch of bones, and my sister sat on the top step of the stairs, swinging her legs and quietly humming some eerie melody. "What are you writing?" I asked, trying to distract myself from the noises below. My sister looked up at me. Her eyes always seemed too large, as if she could see more than others. On her lap lay a notebook with her university's logo, and in her hand was a pencil with a broken tip. "Just jotting things down," she replied, smiling again. Her voice was calm, but her words were cold. "What's going to happen to all of us tonight?" It's important." A chill ran down my spine. She'd always been a little strange, even for our family. But tonight her oddness felt different, more pronounced. The voices in the basement grew louder. My father said something harsh, abrupt, but I couldn't make out the words. Then there was a crunch, like something heavy striking bone. The sound froze me in place. My sister kept writing as though nothing had happened. When I finally gathered my courage, I quietly cracked open the door. I hadn't been allowed into the process yet, but I was always curious and wanted to be involved because they were my family. As it seemed to me then, they were the people closest to me. The staircase down was lit by a dim light. The air was thick like a film, and each step echoed in my ears. I saw my father standing over the victim, slowly turning the handle of a mechanism with gears, which lifted the prisoner's body upside down, whistling my sister's tune. The victim seemed to submit to the situation passively. His face was strangely calm, even as his body began to rise upside down. He looked up and met my gaze. There was no fear in his look, only a dark, endless void, as if he knew that we were all already dead. "What are you doing here?" My father's voice was louder than usual. He snapped me out of my stupor. I turned around sharply and ran up the stairs, feeling the weight of the victim's gaze on me. Even after I closed the door and hid in my room, that gaze continued to haunt me. But that wasn't all. That night I heard noises from the basement again. Steps, heavy, unhurried, as if someone deliberately wanted to draw attention. The staircase creaked so loudly that I shuddered in bed. I didn't dare open the door to my room, but the sound got closer. Then it stopped. I held my breath. The doorknob turned slowly, creaking mournfully, but no one entered. Silence, thick as sticky cobwebs, enveloped the house. I lay motionless, feeling the cold sweat trickling down my temples. And only then did I realize that I could hear neither voices nor rustling from the basement. Only the footsteps, which slowly receded towards my grandmother's room. I don't remember how I fell asleep, but the morning greeted me with silence, which turned out to be scarier than the night sounds. Something had changed in the house. I got out of bed, an inner instinct telling me to keep quiet. I got dressed and just sat waiting. Suddenly, a scream tore through the house's silence like an explosion, filled with pain and fear. I dropped the book I was mechanically flipping through, trying to distract myself from the oppressive feeling that had enveloped the entire house since the new prisoner was brought in. My heart thudded loudly in my chest, as if warning me not to stay put. The scream repeated, but this time it sounded muffled, as if the person emitting it was trying with all their might to force it out of their throat. It was my brother's voice. I jumped to my feet and froze for a second in indecision. Run? Hide? Or find out what was happening? The corridor stretched before me like a dark maw, barely illuminated by the dim light of the lamp at the end. The floorboards under my feet creaked loudly, too loudly, as if warning everyone in the house of my movements. I froze on the stairs as sounds of a struggle reached my ears. Heavy breathing, muffled thumps, a raspy whisper mixed with indistinct words. I descended, trying not to breathe, and stopped on the last step. The scene that unfolded before me I would never forget. My brother lay on the floor. His face was contorted with pain, and he was frantically trying to crawl backward, leaving behind spreading crimson stains. One of his arms was unnaturally bent, and the other dangled limply. Above him towered the very man who had been brought into the house the day before. Chains still hung from his wrists, but now they were torn, as if made of paper. My mother stood against the wall, her shoulders shaking, a kitchen knife gleaming in her hands. Her face was pale as if all the blood had drained away to her heart, which seemed to beat in fierce agony. "Don't come closer," she screamed in a trembling voice, pointing the knife at the prisoner. He didn't even turn around. His attention was entirely focused on my brother. The victim did not hurry. His movements were measured, almost lazy, but they carried incredible strength, as if he could break anything he touched. "Back off." My mother took a step forward, but then the prisoner suddenly turned around. His gaze fixed on her, cold, impassive, but somehow devastating. She stepped back, her knife wavered, and I noticed her fingers losing their grip. My brother tried to stand up, his lips quivering, but he still tried to say something, to shout something out. I saw the prisoner pick up a piece of metal from the floor, heavy with rusty edges sharp as knives. A swing. The sound was dull, wet, as if someone had crushed an overripe fruit. The entire scene before my eyes turned black and white, like a sepia filter, but red, too red. My brother jerked, his body arched, and then he collapsed back onto the floor. No. Mom lunged forward with the knife, screaming in a way I had never heard before, but the prisoner was quicker. He parried her thrust so easily as if she were a child. Grabbing her arm, he twisted it, forcing her to drop the knife. Her scream became piercing, and I covered my ears to block it out. I stood there, glued to the steps, unable to tear my gaze away from what was happening. The prisoner held Mom by the shoulder, his fingers digging into her skin, and I could see her gradually losing strength. He leaned into her, and his gaze was icy, empty, yet it shimmered with some elusive cruelty. Let her go. The words escaped me before I could realize what I had done. He turned to me. At that moment, the air around me seemed to thicken, become heavy. His eyes met mine, and a shiver ran through my body. This was not the gaze of a man. I used to imagine our family as in a discovery show. Here we are, a pack of wolves hunting those who are weak. We are the city's scavengers and feed on those who couldn't hide. Evolution. But this man, in his gaze there was something simultaneously human and predatory, something terrifyingly relentless. He didn't kill for food, he did it for entertainment. Or revenge. I didn't know. Mom fell to the floor as his attention shifted to me. She breathed heavily, her hands clutching her chest, and her eyes were closed as if she were praying. The prisoner took a step towards me, then another. His movements were smooth, measured, but each step sounded louder than the last. I couldn't move. My legs were rooted to the floor and my throat was dry. He stopped in front of me and leaned down, his face at my level. "Why are you silent?" he whispered, and his voice was low, calm, almost gentle, making him even more terrifying. He looked into my eyes and I felt something inside break. It wasn't fear or horror. It was something more, as if he saw right through me, saw things about myself I didn't know. Then he turned and walked away, leaving silence behind him. Only the sound of rain outside disturbed this emptiness. I slumped on the steps, trying to catch my breath. My brother was dead. Mom wasn't moving. Dad and Grandma were nowhere to be seen. And I couldn't understand what would happen next. The house filled with a strange silence, only broken by my mother's labored breathing as she still lay on the floor, clutching her shoulder. For the first time in my life, paralyzed by fear, I didn't move, watching her. But the silence didn't last long. From somewhere deep in the house, a dull thump sounded, as if something heavy had fallen. Mom jerked, her eyes snapped open, and panic filled them. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled and she fell back to her knees. "Where is he?" she whispered, barely maintaining her balance. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt as if it were being strangled by an invisible noose. Instead, I just pointed towards the staircase leading upstairs. Mom froze, her gaze glazed over, but then determination appeared in it. "Find your sister," she whispered, and leaning on the wall got to her feet. "I'll deal with him." Her voice trembled, but it still carried the commanding tone I had always obeyed since childhood. I nodded and slowly walked deeper into the house, each movement made with incredible difficulty. My sister must be in her room. Her door was slightly open, and a familiar whisper came from inside. I peeked in and saw her sitting on the floor with her old doll in her hands. She was whispering something to the toy, as if it was her only protection. "He's here," she said without lifting her head. Her words struck me like a hammer. "Who?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. My sister slowly raised her eyes to mine. There was no fear in her gaze, only a strange understanding that made me shiver. "You know who. He's come for us. The Skinwalker." At that moment, a scream tore through the air. It was Grandma. I flinched and rushed to the exit, leaving my sister with her doll. Grandma never screamed. Never. Her voice had always been our voice of authority, calm and confident. This scream was full of horror and pain, as if it had been torn from the very depths of her heart. The clatter from the pantry sounded like someone had thrown canned goods into a washing machine at full spin. When I reached the pantry, the door was wide open. Inside was chaos. Shelves were overturned, spice jars shattered. Knives she had always kept in perfect order were scattered. Furniture was broken. Amidst all this disorder, her body lay on the floor in an unnatural position. Her eyes were open, but there was no life in them. I heard steps. Heavy, calm, slow. He was very close. I backed away, but then something tugged at my arm. It was Mom. Her face was as white as chalk, but her eyes burned with defiance. "Run," she said, pushing me towards the corridor. "What about you?" I cried out, feeling panic squeeze my chest. "Don't argue, save your sister." She turned around and entered the pantry, where the air was saturated with the smell of death. I saw her pick up a knife she found among the scattered items. Her hands were shaking, but her gaze was firm. I took off running as fast as I could. The noise of the struggle behind me grew louder, the dull thuds mixing with my mother's furious screams. I wanted to stop, to turn back, to help her, but my legs automatically carried me towards my sister. When I reached her room, she was already standing in the center, holding the doll. I heard a sound like something heavy falling behind us. My mother's scream was abruptly cut off. A frightening silence followed. My sister approached me and extended the doll. "Take it," she said quietly. "Why?" "It needs to be protected from the Skinwalker." I didn't know what to do. The world around me was crumbling, and all that was left was to heed my sister's strange, enigmatic words. I took the doll, and she smiled as if it was the most important thing in her life. But at that moment, the silence was once again broken. Steps slow and heavy echoed through the corridor. He was here. Where was Dad? Why wasn't he here when we needed him the most? Out hunting again. We were alone, locked in this room, feeling like our lives were about to end. The killer's steps sounded like an impending sentence. Heavy, rhythmic. They filled the house like the sound of a huge pendulum counting down the final seconds. My sister and I were in her room. The light that had been on before had long since gone out. The only thing now illuminating the room was the weak moonlight seeping through the cracked window. My sister sat on the floor, leaning against the wall. Her face was tense, but she did not seem scared. Her long dark hair covered half her face, and her hands tightly clutched the old doll she never parted with. "You need to leave," she said calmly, although her voice trembled. "No, we need to be together," I replied, looking at her. Her eyes, usually soft and thoughtful, were now sharp, filled with determination. "I'm older, stronger. He'll come for me first," she added, standing up. My sister walked over to the wardrobe and opened its door. "Hide," she commanded, not lifting her gaze. "This is madness. You can't stop him," I tried to object, but she interrupted me. "You don't have to. Just survive." I wanted to argue, but her tone left no room for choice. Reluctantly clenching my fists, I climbed inside and quietly closed the door. Through the cracks, I watched as she stood in the middle of the room, gripping a wooden leg from a broken chair. The killer's steps grew closer. The door to her room opened slowly, as if he deliberately wanted to prolong the moment. His silhouette appeared in the doorway, tall, menacing. The moonlight illuminated his face, expressionless, almost inhuman. My sister did not flinch. As soon as there was enough space between the door and the frame, my sister, like a wild lynx, lunged at him with a scream, wielding the wooden leg. Her scream cut through the silence, filled with all the rage she could muster. I heard only that she managed to knock him down in the corridor and they struggled there. I cracked the wardrobe door to see what was happening, but they were far down the corridor, and I could only see the vague outlines of their struggling silhouettes. At one point, it seemed to me that the man was on top, but my sister's silhouette kept moving. I wanted to run out to help her, but my legs refused to obey. I could only watch as she tried to fight, desperately trying to save us both. But the Skinwalker was too strong, too fast. I heard as my sister hit him in the face one last time. I closed my eyes and froze, suffocating from fear and horror. The Skinwalker's steps sounded again, but this time they were leaving. He left the room, leaving behind only the cold silence and the body of my sister. I crawled out of the wardrobe, not remembering how I did it. My legs were weak, but I approached her. Her eyes were open, but they saw nothing. The doll lay next to her, its glass eyes staring straight at me, as if accusing. I wanted to scream, but couldn't. All I could do was pick up her doll and hold it close. Now I knew I was alone. The killer was still somewhere in the house, but I was next. The house sank into a ringing silence. Every creak echoed, and the air felt heavy, as if a stone had been placed on my shoulders. I slowly made my way through the corridor, clenching my fists, trying not to think about what I had seen upstairs. The image of my sister lying motionless haunted me, but I couldn't stop. The killer's steps echoed somewhere below, heavy as hammer blows. He moved slowly, as if he knew that no one could stop him. I knew if I stopped, he would find me. I reached the staircase leading to the first floor. The steps were covered in bloodstains that clung to the wooden floorboards. It was dark below. The only light seeped from the kitchen, where a broken lamp swung, casting strange, distorted shadows. As I entered the kitchen, the smell hit me in the face. It was the scent of blood mixed with iron, sweat, and something indescribable. On the floor lay my mother. Her arms were spread out as if in defense, but I saw a knife lying next to her. A grimace of pain was frozen on her face, and her eyes, still open, stared into the void. I froze. Something clenched so tightly in my chest that I couldn't breathe. This was my mother, the person who always seemed like an unshakable support, now dead. I slowly knelt beside her. I wanted to close her eyes, but my hands wouldn't obey. Hot tears streamed down my cheeks, and I felt something inside me break. The silence was interrupted by footsteps. They sounded very close in the corridor. I raised my head, still sitting on the floor. He was here. I quickly stood up and grabbed the knife lying next to my mother's body. My hands trembled, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I dashed out of the kitchen, not knowing where I was going, just trying to escape from his footsteps. The corridor led to the living room. Everything was overturned. Chairs, books, a picture on the wall. It all seemed destroyed, just like our lives. I heard my father's voice from the other end of the house. "Where are you?" His shout echoed loudly, resounding, and I felt fear give way to hope. I ran towards his voice, but stopped when I heard a sound behind me. The killer was walking down the corridor, approaching me. His steps were measured, confident, like a hunter who had already caught his prey. I hid behind a door and peered through a narrow slit. His silhouette appeared in the dim light, tall and menacing. He stopped, turned his head as if sensing my presence, but didn't move. Then he continued walking. I waited until his figure disappeared, then ran towards my father. He was in the pantry. The flashlight illuminated old boxes thrown on the floor. In his hands, my father held a shotgun, his face focused, but from the expression in his eyes, I could tell he was scared. "Are you all right?" he asked without turning to me. I nodded, but words failed to escape my tongue. "Good," he continued, reloading the shotgun. "Listen to me. I'll distract him. You need to find a way out of the house." I wanted to object, but he turned back to the weapon, checking the cartridges. "Go," he said without looking back. "This is your only chance." I saw that arguing was pointless. Clenching my teeth, I turned and ran to the staircase leading to the second floor. Behind me, the sound of a door opening and the killer's heavy steps filled the air. Father raised the shotgun, and a loud bang echoed through the corridor. I didn't look back. At that moment, I understood. This was his fight. I quickly ascended the stairs and hid behind a table at the top. For a moment, there was silence. Then another shot tore through the silence of the house, like thunder striking the heart of the night. I heard the echo of that sound bouncing off the walls. All was quiet again, but then a dull thud. Something heavy had fallen. It was my father. He lay in the corridor, his shotgun next to him, trying to push himself up on his elbows. His breathing was labored, ragged, but he was still fighting. A sharp blade shaped like a horn fragment was embedded in his chest. The killer stood over him, tall, dark as death itself. His shoulder was bloodied, but he seemed unaffected by it. His face remained impassive, as if he was acting according to some predetermined plan. Father lunged, grabbing the shotgun, and fired again. The Skinwalker's clothing fluttered from the hot blast and buckshot, but his body remained motionless, as if he were made of stone, or as if the buckshot had simply passed through him. It was the last cartridge. "Come on, then," Father shouted, throwing the shotgun aside and pulling out a knife he had kept at his belt. The killer tilted his head, his gaze studying my father like a predator assessing resistant prey. He stepped forward slowly and confidently. Father lunged at him, stabbing the knife into the killer's chest, but the killer deftly caught his arm and deflected it aside. The killer's strength was incredible. He squeezed Father's wrist so hard that the knife fell from his grasp. "You won't get him," Father rasped before the killer struck him in the face. The blow was swift and precise, and Father collapsed to the floor. I watched, holding my breath. Fear rooted me to the spot, and I couldn't scream or move. Father lifted his head, blood streaming down his lips, but he was still not giving up. He reached for another knife that lay nearby. "You're weaker than I thought," he whispered, and I felt his words fill me with a strange mix of pride and horror. But the Skinwalker was no longer playing. He grabbed Father by the throat and lifted him as if he weighed nothing. I saw Father's face pale, but his gaze remained firm. I wanted to do something. I wanted to scream, to run out of hiding, but I knew that would only doom me. The killer swung forcefully and slammed Father against the wall. His body fell to the floor, leaving a bloody smear on the wall. I saw Father move for the last time. He raised his hand but could no longer do anything. The killer stood over him, his figure as still as a monolith. I turned away, no longer able to watch, but the sound of the final blow haunted me. It was a heavy, wet sound, and I knew Father would not get up again. The killer stood still in the silence, as if savoring the moment of his victory. I pressed against the wall, feeling my heart beating so loudly it seemed he might hear it. When I looked again, he was moving. Slowly, as if in no hurry, he turned and walked deeper into the house. His steps were clear and measured. I realized that he was now looking for me. Father had done everything he could to stop him, but now I was alone, and this time I wasn't sure I could survive. The house was no longer a home. It had become a labyrinth of shadows and rustles, soaked with fear. Every corner hid a threat. Every step seemed like a trap. The air was thick, saturated with the smell of decay and fear. I sat on the floor in the corridor, trying to steady my breathing. The walls seemed to be closing in, squeezing me in their grim embrace. The creak of the floorboards again broke the silence. It was his steps, heavy, rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock counting down to the end. I knew he would not stop, that no one in this house could defeat him. I stood up, staggering, and ran. I didn't think about where to go. I just knew I needed to keep moving, otherwise I would be his next victim. His steps followed me like an ominous shadow. I sped past my sister's room, past the kitchen where my mother's body still lay. The darkness stretched its hands out after me, and his silhouette flickered at the edges of my vision. When I reached the staircase leading to the attic, I barely felt my legs anymore. My hands trembled as I grasped the railing and began to climb. The boards of the staircase creaked so loudly I thought they were giving me away with every second. The attic was dark and cramped. Only a weak beam of light pierced through the cracks in the roof, slicing through the darkness like a blade. I pulled the ladder up after me and huddled in a corner, trying to hide in the shadows. His steps stopped at the base of the staircase. I held my breath. Silence, thick, viscous. I could hear only my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. He knew I was here. I felt it. Even without seeing his face, I knew he was looking up, sensing my presence. I noticed something shiny next to me, a piece of metal, an old rusty crowbar. My fingers trembled as I grabbed it. A weapon, No, but at least something. The boards of the staircase creaked. He was climbing up, slowly with each step, as if savoring this moment. My fear became almost tangible. I pressed against the wall, clutching the crowbar so tightly my fingers turned white. His head appeared in the opening. Dim light fell on his face, and I saw those eyes again, hidden under a powerful brow, cold, lifeless, devoid of human life. He looked straight at me, not rushing to enter. His movements were smooth, almost graceful, as he stood in the attic, blocking all the space. I saw the blood dried on his hands, its smell filling the air. I didn't breathe, waited. His steps were quiet. He approached slowly. I felt the crowbar tremble in my hands. When he came closer, I lunged. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just struck. The crowbar hit his shoulder with a dull sound, but he didn't even flinch. His gaze fixed on me, and in it I saw something new. Not anger, not pain, but perhaps a slight surprise. He effortlessly pulled the crowbar from my hands as if he was taking a toy from a child. I stepped back, tripped, and fell to the floor. He approached, leaned over, and I saw his shadow cover me. But at that moment, a sound from below reached us, the crack of glass, a loud crash. His head jerked in that direction, and he froze for a second. I didn't know what had caught his attention, but that moment gave me a chance. I grabbed a plank that was lying nearby, and with all my strength I hit him on the head. He staggered, more from surprise than from the impact of my blow. His gaze turned back to me, and I felt panic surge anew. But he did not continue. Instead, he straightened up, as if making a decision, and slowly turned around. His steps were as confident as ever. He went downstairs, leaving me in the cold silence of the attic. I lay there, feeling the tremors that shook my body. Why had he left? What had distracted him? Questions swirled in my head, but there were no answers. I sat in the attic long after he had left, shaking all over. The night seemed endless. When I finally dared to go downstairs, my legs were wobbly. The air was saturated with the smell of death. Every corner I turned confronted me with what had once been my family. I tried not to look, but how can you ignore what was a part of you? I needed to get out, to survive. But the house seemed resistant. Every door creaked. Every floorboard squeak seemed to whisper, "Stay, don't go." When I made it outside, the air hit my face with a cold, damp wave. I smelled the forest surrounding our house, but it no longer seemed soothing. In the darkness, the trees resembled huge guards watching my every move. I ran, not knowing where I was headed. Branches whipped my face, roots caught at my feet, but I kept moving, driven by the fear that propelled me away from the house. After what felt like hours, I emerged onto a road. It was empty. The dark ribbon of asphalt stretched in both directions, illuminated only by the weak moonlight. I stopped, breathing heavily, feeling the cold sweat running down my temples. I started walking along the road, not knowing where it would lead. My legs were weak from exhaustion, but I couldn't allow myself to stop. My steps echoed in the night silence as if I were not alone. When I heard the sound of an engine, I almost cried. The headlights of a truck cut through the darkness, lighting up the road ahead of me. I raised my hand, trying to catch the driver's attention, but the moment the light touched my face, I realized how I must look. Covered in mud and reddish-brown stains, with disheveled hair and a look of terror. The truck came to a screeching halt. The cab door opened and the driver got out. He was a man in his 50s, with a thick gray beard and eyes that scanned me from head to toe. "Damn, kid, are you okay?" he asked in a raspy voice. I opened my mouth to respond, but only a sob came out. The man stepped closer, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. "Listen, get in the cab. You're shaking all over." He gestured toward the door. I hesitated to move at first. Something inside me resisted, but I knew I had no choice. I nodded and headed to the vehicle, my legs trembling with each step. Inside the cab, it was warm, the smell of tobacco mixed with the spicy scent of old upholstery. I sat down, pressing against the door, while the driver took his seat and started the engine. "So, what happened to you?" he asked, glancing at me. All dirty, and that's blood, isn't it? I was silent. I didn't know where to begin. How could I explain that my entire family was dead? That someone or something was killing us off one by one? All right, if you don't want to talk, that's fine. Calm down. We'll get to the nearest police station and they'll help. I wanted to thank him, but he spoke again before I could. You know, strange night tonight, he said, looking back at the road. On my way here, I saw some guy walking right down the middle of the road, like he didn't care. Those words made my heart constrict. What did he look like? I asked, my voice hoarse, barely audible. The driver frowned as if trying to remember. Tall, thin, face like a dead man. He looked at me, then just disappeared into the woods. My body went cold. He was here. The truck crossed the bridge. Below us, the river roared, its sound the only thing breaking the silence inside the cabin. I gripped the edge of the seat, trying not to think about what lay ahead. The night air inside the truck was stuffy, despite the open window. The noise of the engine filled the space, but it couldn't distract from the anxious thoughts buzzing in my head like a swarm of wasps. The moon had disappeared behind clouds, leaving the road plunged into darkness that seemed endless. I sat, pressed against the door, my hands still trembling. The driver's words about the person he had seen on the road lingered in my mind. I knew it was him. It was the very one who had ripped me from my normal reality, destroying everything I once knew. But why me? Why had he left me alive? The truck slowly navigated the winding road, which seemed unending. The driver was saying something, but his voice was muffled, as if he were speaking from another room. I wasn't listening. My entire reality had narrowed down to one question. What was that? I looked at my hands. They were still covered in the dried blood, not just of my family. It didn't feel like my own blood. It seemed to cling to my skin, leaving a heavy feeling. We're almost there, the driver said, casting a brief glance at me. His voice brought me out of my trance. I nodded, although I didn't know where we were heading. My gaze fixed on the window. The darkness of the forest outside seemed alive, as if something was moving, watching. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was inside me. Something dark, foreign was awakening, stirring. I felt it like a heat emanating from deep within my soul. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something new. Hey kid, are you okay? The driver's voice again cut through the silence. I turned to him but found no words to say. It felt like my voice no longer belonged to me. Instead, I nodded, though I knew it was a lie. The truck entered a small town. The streets were empty. The houses stood like ghostly shells, only a few lampposts casting dim light on the road. The driver pulled up in front of an old police station. Here we are, he said, turning off the engine. Go on, get inside. Tell them what happened. I wanted to get out, but something held me back. Fear, dread, or maybe a premonition that it was all futile, that I no longer belonged to this world. You going? The driver looked concerned, his gaze studying me as if he knew something was off. I opened the door, but before stepping out, I glanced back out the window. In the distance, in the darkness, I saw a figure, a shadow barely discernible, but I knew it was him. He stood there, motionless, staring right at me. My breathing quickened. I stepped out of the truck, my legs trembling as I made the first move. The driver waved towards the police station, but I no longer saw him. All sounds had faded, as if the world around had frozen. I moved towards the figure. Every cell in my body screamed for me to stop, but I couldn't. This person, he was a magnet drawing me in. As I got closer, I realized he wasn't moving. His face remained as empty as ever, but something in his eyes had changed. There was a reflection. My reflection. I stopped looking at him. He didn't say a word, but something inside me broke. Or perhaps it became whole. From my earliest years, I had seen death, first pets, then victims of our family. And somehow I had stopped understanding what emotions were. Then a wave hit me, full of everything. Grief, fear, loneliness, pain, and longing. For the first time in my life, I cried. I stood there crying, not afraid to show my tears before the Skinwalker. I heard his heavy breathing right above me. I don't know how much time passed, maybe minutes, maybe hours, but when I finally took my hands away from my eyes, he was gone. I felt something foreign stirring inside me, as if a part of him had stayed with me. My hands no longer trembled. My mind became quiet. When I returned to the truck, the driver looked at me in surprise. "Where did you go? I called you. You were out there for like 10 minutes. Everything all right?" I nodded, not saying a word, but I knew. Everything had changed. I had changed. The darkness brought by the Skinwalker had brought some of the darkest events into my life, but it had replaced one darkness with another. I climbed the steps to the police station. Now let me share a moment from my life. I'm an artist, and oil painting both inspires and relaxes me. 8 years ago, I was so immersed in it that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day I looked back and realized the knowledge I needed when I was just starting out. That's why I've prepared an online course with 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or pointless chatter. Just rich content that's immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of renting a car for a day. Art therapy is a great way to deal with anxiety. Just check out the course content via the link in the pinned comment or in the channel description.